Hello there. Welcome to Module 2 of the Workplace Safety and Health Risk Management Training course. In this module, you will learn how to conduct a risk assessment. Risk assessments are a key part of risk management. The process can be broken down into 3 simple steps. First, we need to identify the hazards associated with the work activity. Think about anything that could potentially cause harm. Next, we assess the risk. In this step, we evaluate both the potential harm that a hazard can cause and the likelihood of that harm actually happening. This helps us understand the specific risks we're dealing with. Finally, we identify control measures. This is where we figure out how to manage the identified risks and reduce them to a level that's as low as reasonably practicable. Essentially, we're finding ways to minimize those risks effectively. Your workplace should conduct risk assessments for all routine and non-routine operations. Routine operations are those regular, repetitive tasks that are part of the normal operations of an organization. In the telecommunication industry, that would include regular checks and maintenance of network equipment, and responding to unexpected network outages or failures. Whereas for non-routine operations, these are tasks that are not performed regularly and may involve unique or unexpected situations. In the telecommunication industry, that would include emergency repairs and major system upgrades. So let's begin step 1 of how to carry out a risk assessment. Step 1 involves making a list of all the activities that may require a risk assessment. Before you can start to think about the risk assessment process in detail, you must have a clear idea of those activities that have the potential to cause harm. Have a look at what you are doing at work and ask, can any of these activities cause harm if something went wrong? If the answer is yes, then those activities must be on your list. Not all activities at work will cause harm, and as such, you don't need to list those activities. If we did, we would be doing risk assessments for everything that we do. Remember, the key thing is to first think about what could cause harm to people. If there's a possibility of harm, it's on the list. When writing a work task statement, keep it simple by stating what needs to be done, not how the work is to be done. The difference between how to do and what to do is that how to do emphasizes the methods or steps of doing something, whereas what to do emphasizes what should be done. Besides looking at every aspect of the work, it is important to look at past injury and incident records to spot weaknesses. Involve your team members to discuss hazards, as they often know hazards best. The second step of the risk assessment process is to assess the risk level of the identified hazards. The image shows a 5x5 risk matrix that is commonly used in risk management to help organizations evaluate the potential impact and probability of various risks, allowing them to prioritize and mitigate them effectively. The risk level is determined by 2 factors, the severity and the likelihood of that harm actually happening. The severity can be categorized as catastrophic, major, moderate, minor, and negligible. And similarly, the likelihood can be categorized as rare, remote, occasional, frequent, and almost certain. The risk level of an identified hazard is then obtained by multiplying the values of severity and likelihood level. Depending on the total value, the risk can be classified as low, medium, and high. When using the 5x5 matrix, the guidance given in these 2 tables should be used when selecting the level of severity and the level of likelihood. The third step of the risk assessment is to identify control measures. Our goal here is to manage the identified risks so they are as low as reasonably practicable. When it comes to controlling hazards and reducing risks, we rely on the principle of hierarchy of control. This principle is essential because control measures that are higher up in the hierarchy are typically more effective. They reduce risk closer to or at the source. But here's a crucial point. We shouldn't view the control measures in the hierarchy as isolated or standalone solutions. If we can't entirely eliminate a hazard, it's often more effective to use a combination of control measures to manage risks to the lowest practicable level. Let's take a look at some examples of these control measures based on the hierarchy of control. Elimination of risk refers to the total removal of the worker's exposure to the hazards, effectively making all identified work-related accidents incidents and ill health related to the specific hazard impossible. This is a permanent solution and should be attempted first. For example, you can eliminate hazards such as manual handling by using alternative, mechanical means of lifting or by splitting a bulky load into smaller, more manageable parts. Using cordless equipment to get rid of trailing cables. For the risk of infectious disease transmission in the workplace, it can be eliminated by allowing the workers to work from home. Next, let's talk about substitution. This involves swapping out a hazardous process or product with a less hazardous one to reduce risk. For example, instead of using solvent-based paint, we can switch to water-based paint. It's a much safer option. Similarly, we can replace A-frame ladders with step platform ladders, tower scaffolds, or scissor lifts. These alternatives provide a more stable and safer working environment. And for high-level vibrating equipment, we can opt for newer equipment that has less vibration exposure. This not only reduces the risk but also improves overall safety and comfort for workers. Now, let's discuss engineering controls. These are physical measures that help reduce the likelihood of an incident occurring or minimize its severity if it does happen. For instance, we can use extraction machines to remove hazardous dust or fumes from the air, ensuring a safer breathing environment. Another example is enclosing dangerous machinery or moving parts to prevent accidental contact. And to protect against fall hazards, guardrails should be installed along all open edges. Let's move on to administrative controls. These controls focus on eliminating or reducing exposure to hazards by following specific procedures or instructions. For example, enforcing a one-way traffic system on site can help minimize the risk of collisions. Limiting the time workers spend in high-noise areas can reduce their exposure to harmful noise levels. And banning work at height or lifting operations during bad weather ensures that workers aren't put at unnecessary risk due to adverse conditions. Lastly, let's talk about personal protective equipment, PPE. PPE should always be considered as the last line of defense after all other control measures have been explored. The effectiveness of this control heavily relies on selecting the right protective gear, ensuring it fits correctly, is worn at all times, and is properly maintained. To demonstrate that your workplace has carried out risk assessment, it is essential to provide documented evidence to show that it has actually been done. Here is the risk assessment form, which we'll use to document the risk assessment of a work process. The form is divided into 3 key sections. Hazard Identification Section. This is where we identify potential hazards associated with the work process. Risk Evaluation Section. In this section, we evaluate the risks associated with the identified hazards, assessing their likelihood and potential impact. Risk Control Section. Here, we document the control measures that will be implemented to manage the risks, aiming to reduce them to as low as reasonably practicable. Let's walk through an example to illustrate how to document a risk assessment for a work activity. We'll use the example of performing general duties in an office environment. First things first, you need to list all the sub-activities that have the potential to cause harm. Keep in mind that not every activity at work poses a risk, so you don't need to list those harmless activities. When you're writing the sub-activity statement, focus on what needs to be done, rather than how the work is to be done. Many work activities have the potential to cause harm, but for simplicity, let's look at 3 examples. The first one is moving around the office. The hazard here is that workers may slip, trip, or fall due to loose cables, cluttered walkways, and wet floors. When you're describing the hazard, you can frame it as an incident that may occur or an unsafe condition that exists. The severity of injuries resulting from slips, trips, and falls can vary widely, from minor sprains to more serious fractures, depending on the circumstances. The second sub-activity is manual handling of items. The hazard here is that lifting heavy items without using the proper technique can cause injuries. Specifically, the severity of injury can lead to back strain. The third sub-activity is using display screen equipment. The hazard here is that prolonged or improper use of DSE or static posture, incorrect workstation setups, such as improper chair height or monitor placement, can cause strain on the body. Another hazard would be working in an environment with poor lighting, which can lead to headaches or sore eyes. Now that we've completed documenting the hazard identification section, which is step 1 of the risk assessment process, We're ready to fill out Section 2, the Risk Evaluation section. This is Step 2 of the process. Let's use the subactivity of using display screen equipment as our example. First, we'll determine the risk level of the identified hazard. We start by ranking the severity of potential injury or ill health. For bodily pain and discomfort, we rank it as minor, giving it a value of 2. Similarly, for headaches or sore eyes, we also consider it minor, with a value of 2. Next, we look at the control measures already in place to manage the hazard. Let's say we've implemented the following. DSE training for all new starters, requiring new staff to self-assess their workstation and equipment setup to ensure good posture. Providing laptop users with docking stations, screens, keyboards, and mice. Conducting annual lighting assessments. With these control measures in place, we now rank the likelihood of the potential injury or ill health occurring. For bodily pain and discomfort, we rank it as occasional, giving it a value of 3. For headaches or sore eyes, we also rank it as occasional, with a value of 3. To determine the risk rating or risk prioritization number, RPN, we find the intersection of the identified severity and likelihood on the risk matrix. Alternatively, we can compute the RPN by multiplying the value of the severity and the likelihood level. We have completed documenting the first 2 steps of the risk assessment process. Now, let's move on to Section 3, the Risk Control section. This is Step 3 of the risk assessment process, where we check the risk level, or risk prioritization number, RPN, for acceptability. If the risk level is high or the RPN falls in the high zone, the risk must be either eliminated or reduced to at least a medium level by implementing additional controls. In our example, the risk level or RPN is 6, which places it in the medium zone. The recommended actions to consider may include conducting another careful evaluation of the hazards to ensure that the risk level is reduced to as low as reasonably practicable within a defined period. Management might consider implementing additional interim risk control measures, such as administrative controls or PPE, while long-term measures are being established. For our specific example, one potential action is to provide periodic eye tests for employees who need them. Always keep in mind that when considering additional controls to reduce risk, start with control measures that are higher up in the hierarchy of control. Once additional controls have been decided, re-rate the severity, likelihood, and risk levels, or RPN values, and then record them in the respective columns in the Risk Control section of the risk assessment form. The re-evaluated RPN should not exceed the initial RPN and should ideally fall within the low risk, the green zone, if feasible. Once your risk assessments are complete, it's crucial to have a process in place to ensure they are reviewed and updated as needed. Changes over time can introduce new hazards, so current risk assessments must reflect these changes accurately. According to the Workplace Safety and Health Risk Management Regulations, employers are required to review and update risk assessment information in the following scenarios. At least once every 3 years from the last RA approval date. When any bodily injury occurs as a result of exposure to a hazard in the workplace. When there is a significant change in work practices or procedures. By staying vigilant and keeping risk assessments up to date, you can ensure a safer work environment and stay compliant with regulations. Before we close this session, let's recap some of the key takeaways. Risk assessments are a key part of risk management. The process has to be comprehensive, covering both routine and non-routine works. When performing risk assessment, besides looking at every aspect of the work, it is important to look at past injury and incident records to spot weaknesses. It is important to engage your team members in discussions about hazards, as they often have valuable insights and first-hand knowledge. When selecting control measures, prioritize those higher in the hierarchy of control for greater effectiveness. Lastly, always keep your risk assessment information up to date. Changes over time can introduce new hazards, so ensure your assessments reflect any updates. I hope this knowledge empowers you to confidently start carrying out risk assessments. If you ever need further assistance, don't hesitate to reach out to HSE officer.